Hey guys, this is Nick. Welcome to the back porch. Today, I want to look at one of 9Mark's Building Healthy Churches books. This one is Biblical Theology: How the Church Faithfully Teaches the Gospel by Nick Rourke and Robert Klein. Again, this is part of 9Mark's Building Healthy Churches series. These are these small little books that really a pastor or a lay leader or a Sunday school teacher could read to really kind of help give them a jump start, or even if you've never heard of any of these topics, to give you a good basic understanding of them and then to read further, because all of them have some more resources that you can look into. But I want to look at this one today because this is really applicable, especially in regards to how the church itself not only teaches the gospel, but how Christians live their lives. So on the back of this book, it says, how does the church guard against false gospels? This is very key, especially if you consider yourself a Bible-believing Christian, right? So going on, it says, every week, many churches around the world read the Bible but miss the main point and end up teaching false gospels week in and week out. One of the most important safeguards against this danger is an understanding of biblical theology, reading the Bible in light of its main message, culminating in Jesus Christ. Starting with a framework for understanding the storyline of the Bible, and then explaining basic principles for prioritizing the teaching of this message, this book aims to help churches guard the truth of the gospel. And this book does a really good job of helping you understand that. And so, really, what this book does, there's only 6 chapters. This is actually one of the longer ones of the 9Mark series. It's just a little over 100 and maybe 120 pages, so not very long. The rest of them are all a lot shorter. But this one really does a good job of, especially in chapters 3 and 4, defining the big picture of the Bible. Before he gets there, chapter 1 talks about the need for biblical theology, the need for a proper understanding of what the Bible teaches. And then chapter 2, it defines biblical theology. But in chapter 3 and in chapter 4, it's a 2-part series essentially in these 2 chapters on what the Bible's big story is. And here's where a lot of churches really get this wrong. It's really where a lot of churches mess up on this. And frankly, it's where a lot of pastors mess up on this. Because we might randomly open our Bibles and stick our finger somewhere and think that story, whether that's David and Goliath, whether that's Nehemiah, whether that's Esther, whether it's the story of Jonah and the whale, whether it's Paul in Athens or wherever, we don't ever really see how this connects because we're not really looking for it. I started pastoring a little over 2 years ago, and this has been a big deal for me because while I was in college, I was discipled by a few leaders in the church and really shown, because I didn't grow up with this understanding. I grew up in this small town that I'm in now, pastoring in, and seeing the big picture of the Bible was never really on anybody's radar where I grew up. In a lot of ways, being back now, I see that it's still not. But while I was in college, in the church I was a part of, I was discipled to really understand that the whole Bible is about Jesus, and that's really where the big picture of the Bible comes back to. So the Bible really has 4 main plot lines that all culminate in the work of Jesus. And it's creation, which we see in the first couple of chapters in Genesis. Fall, Genesis 3, so man enters into sin. Man sins, and we fall. And then there's redemption. So the rest of the Bible really kind of lays out God's plan of redemption. That's through his covenant with Israel. It's through his covenant with Abraham before that. It's through his covenant with Israel at Mount Sinai after the Exodus. It's with his covenant with David. And the Bible is really about the covenant of God with his chosen, called out people. And then we get to Christ, and there's this new covenant that Jesus establishes. And then the 4th really main plot line really is restoration, where we see through the work of Jesus, we are restored to our right relationship with God. And that's the big picture of the Bible. That's the meta-narrative, if that's the phrase you want to call it, of Scripture. And it's good to understand these things, because then what you can see is you can go back to Genesis 1 and you can see Jesus there. You can go to the fall in Genesis 3 and see when God proclaims his curse upon the serpent in Genesis 3:15, what he's doing is giving mankind the first promise of the gospel, where he says, from the seed of the woman, the seed will crush your head, serpent, and you shall bruise his heel. This happens on the cross of Christ on that first Easter, or on that first Good Friday, which we're getting ready to celebrate. So it's really helpful to understand this, because then you can start to see Christ through all of the Bible. And it's important, because if you don't, you start to do things like one pastor in Atlanta, whose name I won't call, but you could probably easily Google this and find it, that is saying we need to really detach ourselves from the Old Testament, because the God of the Old Testament is really angry and bitter and calls people to kill people and all this thing. And he's not the same Father of Jesus in the New Testament. That's a heresy called Marcionism that was defeated in the 2nd century of the early church. I mean, there's nothing new under the sun, as Solomon says in Ecclesiastes. There's nothing new. All of these heresies are still going on today. There's just new people with a louder microphone than there was a couple of thousand, about 2,000 years ago. But that being said, understanding the right, or rather the big picture of the Bible, helps you to see the importance of the whole of Scripture. And then in chapters 5 and 6, he goes on to talk about how biblical theology shapes the church's teaching. Because again, if we have a right understanding of what the Bible is teaching, we're going to be able to then shape our teaching around what Scripture says. And frankly, we can start to see the gospel in everything. So as weird as it might sound, you go to the book of Joshua and read about the conquest generation as they're coming into the promised land, and they're killing all kinds of folks, cleaning out the promised land as God has commanded them. For us today, in our sensibilities, that bothers us, because would a God of love command his people to kill people like he does in Joshua? There's a reason God does this. And if you understand the true story of the Bible, if you understand the big meta-narrative of the Bible, you understand why God commanded this. And frankly, you can see the gospel within that story. That doesn't sit well with a lot of people. It may not sit well with a lot of people that like to watch my videos. I don't know. But with a right understanding of the whole picture of the Bible, if you see how God has worked throughout history, you start to see why and how, as God, who is sovereign and who is the creator of the universe, can command what he wants of his creation, because he's God and we are not. So you can see these things. And then also the last chapter is biblical theology shapes a church's mission. And this is absolutely correct. As a church starts to focus on what the church's mission is, which I would argue starts at the very least in Matthew 28, 19 and 20. Our mission begins in Jesus' commission to us to go and to make disciples. And so that's where our mission begins. And if you understand biblical theology right, if you understand where Jesus fits in within the entire story of the Bible, you can really understand how that shapes the mission of a church. And so, again, this is a great little book if you're a pastor, if you're a small group leader, if you're a Sunday school teacher, or if you're just a regular Joe Schmo that comes to church on Sundays and you're wanting to know a little bit more about the Christian faith, or if you're somebody that's curious about the Christian faith, this is a good place to start. It probably isn't the best place to start because this is predicated on the idea that you already are a believer. But I would suggest, if you want a good understanding of biblical theology, of a right biblical theology, check out this little book called Biblical Theology, How the Church Faithfully Teaches the Gospel by Nick Rourke and Robert Klein, part of Nightmark's Building Healthy Churches series. And so, again, hope you guys are doing well during this lockdown, during these stay-at-home orders. I know that my wife and I are. We're both pretty introverted in a lot of ways, so really this just gives us an opportunity to read and rewatch The Office and play some video games and do all that kind of stuff while we're also working at home. Obviously, I'm a pastor, so most of my work either revolves around reading or writing anyway. And so that's what's going on here, and hope you guys are doing well in your own lockdowns. Hope you're not too restless or cabin fevery, and let's just continue to pray that this ends soon. And so hope you guys are doing well. Take care, and God bless.